The whistle cut through the freezing air like a blade, and before the sound even faded, Ellie Turner was already moving. Mud sucked at her boots. Rain hammered the obstacle course in cold, relentless sheets. Somewhere behind her, a cadet screamed in frustration as he slipped and fell face first into a trench of water. Nobody stopped to help him. Nobody ever did. That was the rule of the Academy's hardest test, the one every recruit whispered about with a mix of fear and disbelief. They called it the impossible. Ellie's lungs burned. Her arms ached from the last climb, her palms raw from gripping rope soaked through with rain. But her eyes stayed fixed ahead, calm and sharp, like she was solving a puzzle instead of fighting for survival. Around her, 20 other cadets pushed and shoved, desperate to beat the clock, desperate to prove they belonged. She did not push, she did not shove, she simply moved, one precise step after another, as if the chaos around her did not exist. At the top of the ridge, Sergeant Daniel Marsh stood with his arms crossed, watching the trial unfold with the practiced boredom of a man who had seen 100 cadets crumble under the exact same pressure. His eyes found Ellie in the crowd, and for a moment, his jaw tightened. He had heard about her, the quiet one, the one who barely spoke in formation, who kept her head down during meals, who never once raised her hand to answer a question in the classroom. He assumed, like most of the instructors did, that quiet meant weak, that she would be the next to fall. He had been wrong about cadets before. He was rarely wrong twice. The course ahead twisted through a series of brutal stations, each one designed to break a person down, physically and mentally. There was the rope wall, slick with rain, that had claimed 3 cadets already this season. There was the crawl tunnel, barely wide enough for a body, filled with freezing water that numbed the skin within seconds. And beyond that, waiting like a final judgment, stood the tower, a sheer structure of metal and rope that cadets had to scale in full gear, time to the second. Ellie reached the rope wall as 2 cadets ahead of her slipped and fell, cursing under their breath, scrambling to try again. She studied the wall for half a second, no more, then found a foothold nobody else had used, a crack in the wood slightly higher than where everyone else grabbed. She pulled herself up in one clean motion, her body steady despite the rain lashing against her face. At the top, she paused just long enough to glance down at the chaos below her, then dropped to the other side without a sound. A cadet named Ryan Coleman noticed. He was one of the strongest recruits in the academy, built like someone who had trained his entire life for exactly this moment. He had assumed, from the very first day, that this trial belonged to him. When he saw Ellie clear the wall faster than he had, something cold settled in his chest. He pushed harder, driven by an anger he didn't fully understand, determined not to let a quiet, unremarkable cadet outpace him. The crawl tunnel came next, and this was where most cadets lost their nerve. The water inside was so cold it stole the breath from your lungs the moment you entered. Cadets before Ellie hesitated at the entrance, some retreating for a second before forcing themselves through, wasting precious seconds. Ellie did not hesitate. She dropped to her stomach and moved through the freezing water with the same steady rhythm she had used on the wall, breathing in short, controlled bursts, refusing to let the cold control her. When she emerged on the other side, soaked and shivering but composed, Sergeant Marsh made a note on his clipboard. It was a small thing, a simple mark, but it was the first time all season he had written anything positive next to a cadet's name during the early stations of the impossible. Grace Whitfield, another cadet and one of the few people at the academy who had bothered to get to know Ellie, watched from a distance as she waited for her own turn. She had roomed with Ellie for 2 months now, and even she was surprised by what she was seeing. Ellie rarely talked about her past, rarely explained why she had joined the academy in the first place. But Grace had noticed things. The way Ellie studied maps long after lights out, the way she practiced her breathing in the dark, slow and deliberate, like she was preparing for something bigger than any of them understood. The tower loomed ahead, the final and most feared station of the day. Cadets climbed in pairs, racing against the clock and against each other, hauling themselves up metal rungs slick with rain, while wearing packs that dragged against their shoulders like anchors. 2 cadets had already failed to reach the top before time ran out, their names marked for review, their futures at the academy suddenly uncertain. Ellie approached the tower and looked up. For the first time since the trial began, she allowed herself a single breath, slow and deep, filling her lungs completely before releasing it. Then she began to climb. Her movements were economical, nothing wasted, nothing rushed. While other cadets grabbed at each rung with desperate, jerking motions, she moved like water flowing over stone, finding the most efficient path upward without ever looking as though she was struggling. Halfway up, her foot slipped on the wet metal, and for a heartbeat, gasps rippled through the cadets watching below. She did not panic. She simply adjusted her grip, found her footing again, and continued climbing, as though nothing had happened at all. At the top, she reached the flag marking the end of the course, and struck it once, the signal that she had finished. She looked down at the ground far below, at the cadets still struggling on the rungs beneath her, at Ryan Coleman pushing himself harder than he ever had in his life just a few stations behind her. She felt something settle inside her chest, quiet and steady, like a held breath finally released. She had beaten the course. But more than that, she had done it without a single wasted motion, without a single moment of visible strain. She descended the tower with the same calm precision she had climbed it with, and when her boots hit solid ground, she did not celebrate. She simply walked to the sideline, wiped the rain from her face, and waited for the trial to end. Sergeant Marsh approached her slowly, his expression unreadable. Around them, cadets who had failed to finish stood in small, defeated clusters, some breathing hard, some nursing bruised knuckles, all of them staring at Ellie with a mixture of confusion and something close to disbelief. He looked down at his clipboard, then back up at her. "Nobody has finished that course clean on their first attempt in 3 years," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. Ellie said nothing. She simply nodded once, a small, quiet gesture, and turned to walk back toward the barracks, leaving the sergeant standing in the rain, staring after her with a question forming in his mind that he wasn't sure he wanted answered. Because if a cadet like her could do this on her very first day, then everything the Academy believed about the impossible, and about who could survive it, was about to be proven wrong. The rain did not let up that night. It hammered against the barracks roof in steady waves, while cadets nursed bruises and swapped stories about the trial, their voices thick with exhaustion and disbelief. In the corner bunk, away from the noise, Ellie sat cross-legged with a worn notebook balanced on her knee, writing in careful, small handwriting by the dim light of a single lamp. Grace watched her from across the room for a long moment, before finally speaking. "You didn't even look tired out there," she said, sitting down on the edge of her own bunk. "Everyone else looked like they were going to collapse. You looked like you were taking a walk." Ellie glanced up, a faint, tired smile crossing her face, the first real expression she had shown all day. "I was tired," she admitted quietly. "I just didn't let it show." Grace tilted her head, curious. "Why not?" Ellie was quiet for a moment, considering the question carefully before answering. "Because the moment people see you struggling," she said, "they start believing you can't do it, and once they believe that, it becomes true, whether it should be or not." Grace didn't have a response to that. She simply nodded, filing the words away, sensing that there was more to her quiet roommate than anyone at the Academy had bothered to notice. Across the barracks, Ryan Coleman sat with a small group of cadets, his jaw tight, his eyes occasionally flicking toward Ellie's bunk. He had trained for this his entire life. He had expected to dominate the impossible, to be the name everyone whispered about with respect. Instead, on the very first day, a quiet cadet nobody had taken seriously had finished the course cleaner than anyone in 3 years. He told himself it was luck. He told himself she would fall apart the moment the real pressure began. But somewhere beneath that certainty, a small, uncomfortable doubt had begun to take root, and it refused to let him rest that night. Outside, in the administration building, Sergeant Marsh sat across from Colonel Daniel Harris, the Academy's commanding officer, a stack of trial reports spread across the desk between them. Harris had built his reputation on the belief that the impossible was exactly that, a trial meant to weed out anyone who did not have the raw strength and unshakable will to survive real combat conditions. He had never once believed a cadet could complete it without visible strain. He read the report twice, before looking up at Marsh with narrowed eyes. "Are you certain about these numbers?" he asked. "I watched her myself," Marsh replied. Clean climb, controlled breathing, no wasted movement. Her heart rate barely spiked according to the monitor. Harris leaned back in his chair, studying the report as though it might rearrange itself into something more believable. Nobody does that on their first attempt, he said finally. Marsh met his gaze steadily. She did, he said, and something tells me this was only the beginning. Outside, the rain continued to fall over the academy grounds, washing the mud from the obstacle course, erasing the footprints of every cadet who had struggled through it that day. But it could not erase what had happened, or the quiet, growing sense among those who had witnessed it, that something at the academy was about to change, whether anyone was ready for it or not. The days that followed felt heavier than the first. Word of Ellie's performance on the opening trial had spread through the academy overnight, twisted and reshaped with every retelling, until some cadets whispered she had cheated, others insisted it had been a fluke, and a rare few, like Grace, simply watched her with quiet curiosity, waiting to see if it would happen again. Training resumed at dawn, colder and harsher than before, as though the instructors had decided to test whether her performance had truly been skill or simply luck. The morning began with a 5-mile run through terrain, deliberately chosen for its unevenness. Jagged rocks and sudden inclines meant to punish anyone who lost focus for even a second. Ellie fell behind almost immediately. Her legs, still sore from the previous day's trial, refused to find their usual rhythm. Cadets who had struggled behind her on the obstacle course now passed her with ease, some throwing quick, satisfied glances her way as they surged ahead. Ryan Coleman was among them, and as he passed her, he offered no words, only a look that made his meaning clear enough. He believed the truth about her had finally surfaced. By the time Ellie crossed the finish line, she was nearly a full minute behind the front group, her chest heaving, sweat mixing with the light morning rain. Sergeant Marsh watched her finish with an unreadable expression, saying nothing as he marked her time on his clipboard. That evening, while most cadets collapsed into their bunks the moment training ended, Ellie sat alone in a quiet corner of the barracks with her notebook open, the pages filled with small, careful notes. She wrote down her exact splits for each mile, comparing them against the times of the cadets who had finished ahead of her. She noted where she had slowed, where her breathing had become uneven, where her stride had lost its efficiency on the uneven terrain. Grace found her there an hour later, still writing by lamplight. "You're allowed to rest, you know," Grace said, dropping onto the bunk across from her. Ellie didn't look up from her notebook. "I will, after I understand what went wrong today." Grace leaned forward, studying the pages filled with numbers and small diagrams of the running route. "What went wrong is obvious. Everyone is exhausted. You pushed too hard yesterday and had nothing left today." Ellie shook her head slowly. "That's part of it. But it's not the whole answer. I lost time on the inclines, not the flat sections. My stride was wrong for the terrain. I was running like it was still yesterday's course." Grace stared at her for a long moment, a mixture of disbelief and quiet respect crossing her face. "You're actually enjoying this, aren't you?" she said finally. "Not the pain, the problem solving." Ellie allowed herself a small, tired smile. "Pain is temporary. Understanding a problem stays with you." Over the following days, Ellie's routine became something close to ritual. Each morning, she trained alongside the other cadets, absorbing every failure, every moment where her body betrayed her expectations. Each evening, while others slept, she studied her notes, adjusting small details, refining her breathing patterns, experimenting with pacing strategies that no instructor had taught her. It was not dramatic. There was no single moment where everything suddenly clicked into place. Instead, it was a slow, steady accumulation of small improvements, each one nearly invisible on its own, but building towards something the other cadets could not yet see. Ryan Coleman noticed none of it. To him, Ellie's early struggle was proof enough that her first day had been an anomaly, a stroke of luck that would not repeat itself. He grew more confident with each passing day, pushing himself harder in front of instructors, ensuring his name stayed at the top of every leaderboard posted outside the mess hall. But Sergeant Marsh noticed something different. He had trained cadets for over a decade, and he had learned to recognize the difference between someone who was breaking down and someone who was quietly rebuilding themselves from the ground up. Ellie's times, while inconsistent day to day, showed a pattern he found difficult to ignore. Her worst days were still improving, incrementally, in ways that suggested deliberate adjustment rather than random chance. He began watching her more closely during training, though he said nothing to her directly. He noted how she adjusted her stance slightly before difficult obstacles, how she seemed to study each new challenge for a brief moment before attempting it, treating every station of the course like a puzzle rather than a test of pure strength. One evening, nearly 2 weeks into training, the Academy introduced a new station to the course, a narrow balance beam suspended high above a pit filled with soft padding, designed to test a cadet's composure under the fear of falling. Several cadets, including some of the strongest in the group, hesitated at the edge, their confidence wavering the moment they looked down at the drop below them. Ryan crossed it quickly, driven by pride more than calm, wobbling twice but refusing to slow down, determined to prove his dominance in front of the instructors watching. When Ellie's turn came, she paused at the edge for a long moment, longer than most cadets had allowed themselves. Some watching assumed she was afraid. Grace, watching from the sideline, understood immediately that she was doing something else entirely. She was studying the beam, measuring its width, calculating the rhythm of her steps before committing to a single movement. When she finally began to cross, her steps were slow and deliberate, each one placed with careful precision, her arms extended slightly for balance, her breathing steady, despite the height beneath her. She did not rush. She did not falter. She reached the other side in a time slower than Ryan's, but with none of the wobbling, none of the visible tension that had marked his crossing. Sergeant Marsh made another note on his clipboard, the second one that told a story different from the one most cadets believed. That night, as the barracks settled into quiet exhaustion, Ellie sat once again with her notebook, adding new details about the balance beam, about the rhythm of her breathing, about the way fear could be managed, rather than simply endured. Grace watched her for a while before finally breaking the silence. "Can I ask you something?" she said. Ellie looked up, nodding once. "Why do you care this much?" Grace asked. "Nobody would blame you for just getting through this like everyone else. Why does it matter so much to prove them wrong?" Ellie considered the question for a long moment, her eyes drifting toward the small notebook filled with careful handwriting. Weeks of quiet, unseen effort condensed into pages nobody else had bothered to read. "It's not about proving them wrong," she said finally. "It's about understanding exactly what I'm capable of. Everyone else is trying to survive this course. I'm trying to master it." Grace didn't respond immediately. She simply studied her roommate for a long moment, sensing, for the first time, the full weight of what was quietly building beneath Ellie's calm exterior. Outside, beyond the barracks walls, the mid-course evaluation loomed closer with each passing day, an event every cadet feared more than any single station of the impossible. It was the trial that decided who would continue training and who would be sent home, the moment where every small improvement, every quiet lesson learned in the dark hours after training, would finally be tested against the full weight of the Academy's expectations. Ellie closed her notebook that night with a quiet certainty settling in her chest. She was not the same cadet who had struggled behind everyone else on that painful 5-mile run, and when the evaluation finally arrived, the entire Academy was about to discover exactly how much she had changed. The morning of the mid-course evaluation arrived with a stillness that felt almost unnatural, the kind of silence that settles over a place right before something significant happens. Cadets gathered before dawn in the courtyard, their breath visible in the cold air, nobody speaking above a whisper. Even Ryan Coleman, usually loud and confident among his group of friends, stood quietly at the edge of the formation, his eyes fixed on the obstacle course stretching out before them, transformed overnight into something far more punishing than anything they had faced before. Colonel Harris addressed the cadets from a raised platform, his voice carrying easily across the courtyard despite its calm, measured tone. "This evaluation exists for one reason," he said, "to determine which of you are ready to continue and which of you are not. There is no room for excuses here. There is no room for luck. Only results." Behind him, Sergeant Marsh stood with a stack of clipboards, his eyes scanning the rows of cadets, until they found Ellie standing near the back, calm and composed, despite the tension rippling through everyone around her. He had watched her closely over the past 2 weeks, and though he had said nothing to anyone about it, A quiet part of him was curious to see what she would do when the pressure reached its highest point. The course had been redesigned entirely for the evaluation, longer and more complex than anything cadets had faced before. It combined every station from the previous weeks into a single continuous trial, forcing cadets to move from the rope wall to the crawl tunnel to the tower without rest, all while carrying additional weight in their packs to simulate real-world conditions. At the very end waited a final station nobody had attempted yet, a sealed chamber designed to test composure under extreme stress, details of which had been kept deliberately secret until the moment cadets reached its entrance. Cadets were released onto the course in small groups, timed individually, but forced to navigate around each other, adding an unpredictable layer of chaos to an already brutal trial. Ryan launched forward with explosive energy the moment his group was released, determined to set a pace nobody could match. Ellie moved differently, controlled and deliberate, conserving her energy for the trial's full length, rather than burning it all in the opening stretch. The rope wall came first, slick with morning frost, more dangerous than it had been in the rain weeks earlier. 2 cadets ahead of Ellie slipped and fell hard onto the padded ground below, one clutching his ankle, wincing but forcing himself back up to continue. Ellie found her foothold quickly, the same crack in the wood she had used weeks earlier, and cleared the wall with the same clean, economical motion, though this time her muscles ached with a familiar strain she had come to recognize and manage rather than fear. The crawl tunnel followed, longer this time, filled with icy water that numbed exposed skin within seconds. Cadets around her gasped and sputtered as they emerged, their movements sluggish from the shock of the cold. Ellie controlled her breathing exactly as she had practiced during quiet nights in the barracks, short, deliberate breaths that kept her body from tensing against the freezing water, allowing her to move through the tunnel with barely a change in pace. By the time she reached the tower, her legs burned with exhaustion, and the added weight in her pack pulled hard against her shoulders. She paused for the briefest moment at the base, allowing herself a single deep breath, the same ritual she had performed weeks earlier, before beginning her climb. Halfway up, her grip slipped on a rung slick with frost, and for a terrifying instant, her body swung dangerously to one side. Gasps rippled from cadets watching below, and Ryan, already finished with the tower and moving toward the final station, glanced back just in time to see her stumble. A flicker of something crossed his face, not quite satisfaction, but close enough to it that he didn't examine the feeling too closely. Ellie's fingers found the rung again, before her body could fall further, her arm muscles screaming in protest as she steadied herself against the tower. She did not look down. She did not allow the fear to spread through her chest. She simply adjusted her grip, exactly as she had trained herself to do, and continued climbing, each movement slower now, more deliberate, but never stopping. At the top, she struck the flag and allowed herself a single ragged breath before beginning her descent, her arms trembling from the strain, but her mind clear and focused on what remained ahead. The sealed chamber waited at the end of the course, a small metal room built into the side of the training grounds, its entrance marked only by a single door and a red light glowing above it. Cadets entered one at a time, and none who emerged were willing to describe exactly what waited inside, their faces pale and shaken, regardless of how they had performed on the rest of the course. Ryan entered before Ellie, and when he emerged nearly 3 minutes later, his breathing was ragged, his hands trembling slightly at his sides. He said nothing as he walked past her, his eyes refusing to meet hers, his usual confidence noticeably absent. When Ellie stepped through the door, the room sealed shut behind her with a heavy metallic sound, plunging her into near-total darkness except for a single dim light overhead. A voice crackled through a hidden speaker, calm and clinical, instructing her to complete a series of complex tasks under a strict time limit, while a low, disorienting alarm sounded continuously in the background, designed to fracture concentration and trigger panic. The first task required her to solve a sequence of mechanical puzzles by feel alone, her hands working in near darkness, while the alarm grew louder with each passing second. Her heart pounded against her ribs, and for a brief moment, panic threatened to rise in her chest, the same instinctive fear that had broken cadets before her. She closed her eyes, though the darkness made little difference, and focused on her breathing, the same slow, controlled rhythm she had practiced every night in the quiet corner of the barracks. She solved the first puzzle with seconds to spare, then moved immediately to the second, a series of levers that had to be pulled in a specific sequence while the room's temperature began dropping rapidly, another layer of stress designed to test her composure. Her fingers grew stiff with cold, but she worked through the sequence methodically, treating the chaos around her as simply another problem to be solved, rather than a threat to be feared. The final task required her to remain perfectly still for 60 seconds, while the alarm reached its loudest point, and the lights flickered erratically around her, testing whether raw stillness under extreme pressure was even possible. Cadets before her had failed this final stage more often than any other part of the entire evaluation, their bodies betraying them with involuntary flinching, their breathing spiraling out of control under the assault of noise and disorientation. Ellie closed her eyes and focused inward, letting the noise become background rather than threat, letting her breathing settle into the same steady rhythm she had used on the balance beam weeks earlier. She did not flinch. She did not allow her muscles to tense against the chaos surrounding her. When the 60 seconds finally ended and the alarm cut to silence, the door unlocked with a heavy click, and she stepped back out into the daylight, her expression calm, her body steady, showing no visible sign of the ordeal she had just endured. Sergeant Marsh, standing near the exit with a small group of instructors, stared at her for a long moment, disbelief evident on his face despite his usual composure. Her heart rate, one of the instructors said quietly, checking the monitor readout with visible confusion. It barely rose above her resting rate the entire time. Marsh said nothing, but the look he gave Ellie as she walked past carried a weight that needed no words. By the time the evaluation results were posted outside the mess hall that evening, a small crowd of cadets had already gathered, murmuring among themselves as they scanned the list of names and scores. Ellie's name sat near the very top, her overall time and composure score higher than every cadet who had attempted the course that day, including Ryan, whose name appeared several positions below hers, a fact that visibly unsettled him as he stared at the board in silence. Whispers spread quickly through the crowd, the same disbelief that had followed her since the very first day now carrying a different weight entirely. This was no longer something that could be dismissed as luck or coincidence. Cadets who had mocked her weeks earlier now studied her from a distance, with something closer to uncertainty, unsure how to reconcile the quiet, unremarkable recruit they remembered with the composed, unshakable cadet standing at the top of the leaderboard. Grace found Ellie sitting alone near the edge of the courtyard that evening, staring out at the darkened obstacle course, her notebook resting closed on her lap for the first time in weeks. "You did it," Grace said, sitting down beside her. "You actually did it." Ellie was quiet for a moment before responding, her voice calm, but carrying an unmistakable note of quiet satisfaction beneath its usual composure. "I understood the problem," she said simply. That's all it ever was. Grace studied her for a long moment, sensing that something had shifted, not just in how the academy viewed Ellie, but in how Ellie viewed herself. The quiet cadet, who had once faded into the background of every room, was gone. In her place stood someone the entire academy would soon be forced to reckon with, whether they were ready for it or not. Across the courtyard, Colonel Harris stood at his office window, watching the crowd slowly disperse from the results board, Sergeant Marsh's report still resting open on his desk behind him. He had built his career on the belief that the impossible existed to reveal the limits of human endurance, the point where even the strongest cadets eventually broke. For the first time in years, he found himself wondering whether those limits were exactly where he had always believed them to be. The final trial arrived on a morning so clear and still that it felt almost deliberate, as though the sky itself understood the weight of what was about to happen. Word had spread through the entire academy in the days leading up to it, not just among cadets but among instructors, staff, and even senior officers who rarely bothered to watch training exercises. Everyone wanted to see whether the quiet cadet who had silenced doubt at every previous stage could do it one final time, under conditions designed to be harder than anything that had come before. The training grounds had been transformed overnight into something unrecognizable. The familiar course, the one cadets had trained on for weeks, had been dismantled and rebuilt into a longer, more complex gauntlet, stretching nearly 2 miles across uneven terrain, incorporating every station from previous trials while introducing several new challenges that had never been attempted by any class before. Bleachers had been set up along the edge of the course, filled with cadets, instructors, and officers. all gathered to witness what many were already calling the true test of the impossible. Ellie stood at the starting line, alongside a small group of finalists, cadets who had performed well enough throughout the season to earn a place in the final trial. Ryan stood among them, his expression unreadable, his earlier confidence replaced by something quieter and more focused, the kind of determination that comes only after genuine doubt has been forced to confront itself. Colonel Harris addressed the crowd from an elevated platform overlooking the course, his voice steady despite the weight of what everyone understood was at stake. "Today is not about proving strength alone," he said. "It is about proving control, precision, and composure under conditions designed to break exactly those qualities. Only those who master themselves will master this course." Sergeant Marsh stood near the starting line, clipboard in hand, his eyes finding Ellie one final time before the trial began. He said nothing, but the small nod he gave her carried more weight than words could have managed. The whistle sounded, and the finalists surged forward across the opening stretch of open terrain, a grueling half-mile run designed simply to exhaust them before the real challenges began. Ryan set an aggressive pace early, determined not to fall behind, as he had during the mid-course evaluation. Ellie moved at a steady, controlled rhythm beside him, refusing to be pulled into a pace that would cost her energy she would need later. The rope wall came next, taller and steeper than the version cadets had trained on for weeks, its surface deliberately treated to reduce grip. Several cadets ahead of Ellie struggled against it, their hands slipping on the treated wood, precious seconds bleeding away with every failed attempt. Ellie studied the wall for the briefest moment, found a different foothold than the one she had relied on before, and pulled herself over with the same economical precision that had defined every trial she had faced. Beyond the wall waited a station nobody had encountered before, a series of narrow platforms suspended above a deep pit, connected by ropes that swayed unpredictably with every step. Cadets had to cross using nothing but balance and controlled movement, with no safety net beneath them beyond thick padding far below. Two cadets ahead of Ellie lost their footing entirely, falling into the padding below, their trial ending in a shower of dust and disappointment. Ellie approached the first platform and paused, exactly as she had at the balance beam weeks earlier, measuring the sway of the ropes before committing to her first step. Her movements were slow but never hesitant, each one calculated to work with the platform's motion rather than against it. Ryan, several platforms ahead, glanced back, just long enough to see her cross with the same eerie calm that had unsettled him for weeks, and something in his expression shifted from resentment into something closer to reluctant respect. The crawl tunnel followed, longer and colder than any version they had trained on, forcing cadets through freezing water for nearly the length of a football field. Cadets emerged shivering uncontrollably, their movements sluggish, their focus fractured by the shock of the cold. Ellie controlled her breathing exactly as she had practiced, moving through the tunnel with a rhythm that kept her body from seizing against the cold, emerging on the other side moving nearly as smoothly as she had entered. The tower waited beyond the tunnel, taller than the version from the mid-course evaluation, its rungs slick with a fine layer of oil deliberately applied to increase the difficulty. Cadets ahead of Ellie struggled visibly, their grips failing again and again, as they fought to climb a structure that seemed determined to reject them. One cadet fell nearly halfway up, landing hard in the padding below, his trial ending with a cry of frustration that echoed across the grounds. Ellie approached the tower and took her single deep breath, the same ritual that had carried her through every previous trial, before beginning her climb. Her hands found each rung with deliberate care, testing her grip before committing her full weight, sacrificing speed for certainty in a way that felt almost instinctive after weeks of quiet practice. Near the top, her foot slipped once against the oil-slick surface, and for a heartbeat, the crowd in the bleachers fell silent, watching as her body swayed dangerously against the structure. She did not panic. She adjusted her grip exactly as she had trained herself to do, found her footing again, and continued upward without a single wasted motion, reaching the top and striking the flag as a wave of quiet murmurs rippled through the watching crowd. Beyond the tower waited the final and most feared station of the entire trial, a redesigned version of the sealed chamber, larger and more complex than the one cadets had faced during the mid-course evaluation. This time, instead of simply enduring noise and darkness, cadets had to complete a series of physical and mental tasks simultaneously, solving puzzles, while navigating a maze of narrow corridors, filled with disorienting flashing lights and sudden bursts of extreme temperature, designed to test the absolute limits of composure under pressure. Ryan entered before Ellie, and when he emerged nearly 5 minutes later, his face was pale, his hands trembling visibly, though he had completed the tasks required of him. He walked past Ellie without a word, his earlier resentment now replaced entirely by something quieter, an acknowledgement that whatever she had, whatever quiet strength had carried her through every trial this season, was something he had never truly understood. When Ellie stepped into the chamber, the door sealed behind her, with the same heavy metallic sound she remembered from weeks earlier, though this time the darkness felt deeper, the corridors ahead more disorienting than anything she had faced before. A voice crackled through the hidden speaker, instructing her to navigate the maze while solving a sequence of puzzles under a strict time limit, all while temperature and lighting shifted unpredictably around her. Her heart pounded harder than it had during the earlier evaluation, the added complexity pushing against the edges of her composure in ways she had not fully anticipated. For a brief, dangerous moment, panic flickered at the edge of her thoughts, the same instinctive fear that had ended so many cadets' trials before her. She closed her eyes, grounding herself in the same steady breathing she had practiced every night for weeks, and forced her mind to slow down, to treat the chaos around her as simply another problem waiting to be solved. She moved through the maze methodically, solving each puzzle with careful, deliberate focus, despite the flashing lights and sudden temperature shifts, designed to fracture her concentration. Sweat gathered at her brow, but her hands remained steady, her breathing controlled, her mind clear, even as the chamber pushed harder against her composure than anything she had faced before. The final challenge required her to complete a complex sequence of controls while standing perfectly still under an overwhelming assault of noise and light, the true test of whether her composure was genuine or simply a performance that would eventually crack under enough pressure. Cadets before her, even the most accomplished ones, had failed this final stage more often than any other part of the trial. Ellie closed her eyes one final time, letting the chaos around her fade into background noise, letting her breathing settle into the same rhythm that had carried her through every trial that season. She did not flinch. She did not allow her muscles to betray the strain building beneath her calm exterior. When the sequence finally completed and the chamber fell silent, the door unlocked, and she stepped back out into the sunlight, her expression composed, her body steady, showing no visible sign of what she had just endured. The crowd in the bleachers had grown completely silent, watching as she emerged, her face calm, her breathing steady, not a single visible sign of strain despite everything the trial had thrown at her. Sergeant Marsh checked the monitor readout with hands that were not entirely steady, staring at the numbers for a long moment before looking up at Colonel Harris, who had descended from his platform to see the results for himself. Her heart rate never crossed into the danger zone, Marsh said quietly. Not once. Through the entire trial. Colonel Harris said nothing for a long moment, staring at Ellie as she walked toward the finish line, her steps steady despite the exhaustion that must have been building beneath her calm exterior. He had spent years believing the impossible existed to reveal the absolute limits of human endurance, certain that every cadet, no matter how skilled, would eventually reach a point where their composure broke under enough pressure. He was no longer certain that belief was true. As Ellie crossed the finish line, the crowd remained silent for a long moment, the weight of what they had just witnessed settling over the training grounds like a held breath finally released. Then, slowly, the silence broke into something else entirely. Not the mocking whispers that had followed her weeks earlier, but a quiet, growing respect that spread through the crowd until even Ryan, standing near the finish line with his own trial complete, found himself joining in. Ellie stood at the finish line, breathing steady, her expression calm despite everything she had just endured, and for the first time since she had arrived at the academy, she allowed herself a small, quiet smile. The impossible had finally met its match. The days following the final trial passed differently than any Ellie had experienced since arriving at the academy. The whispers that once followed her through hallways and mess halls had changed entirely in tone, no longer carrying disbelief or mockery, but something closer to quiet awe. Cadets who had barely acknowledged her presence during her first weeks now nodded respectfully when she passed, some even approaching her directly, to ask how she had managed to remain so composed through every station of the trial. She answered each question with the same quiet honesty that had defined her entire journey, explaining that composure was not something people were simply born with, but something built slowly, through countless small decisions made when nobody else was watching. Many cadets found this answer unsatisfying, hoping instead for some secret technique or hidden advantage that could shortcut the process. Ellie offered none, because none existed. What she had built through months of quiet, disciplined effort that no shortcut could ever replace. Sergeant Marsh requested a formal meeting with her 3 days after the trial concluded, something unusual enough that it drew curious glances from cadets passing through the administration building. When Ellie entered his office, she found him seated behind a desk covered in reports and monitor readouts, the same data that had tracked her heart rate and performance through every stage of the final trial. He gestured for her to sit, studying her for a long moment before speaking. "In 15 years at this academy," he said, "I have never seen a cadet complete that trial with results like yours. Not even close." Ellie remained quiet, waiting for him to continue, unsure exactly what response he expected from her. "I want to understand how," he said finally. "Not for the report, for myself." Ellie considered the question carefully before answering, choosing her words with the same deliberate precision she brought to every challenge she faced. "Everyone assumes composure means feeling nothing," she said. "That's not true. I felt everything. Every second of every trial. Fear, pain, exhaustion, all of it. The difference is, I learned not to let those feelings control what my body did next. Feeling fear and being ruled by it are two very different things." Marsh studied her for a long moment, something in his expression shifting into quiet understanding. "Most cadets never learn that difference," he said. "Most cadets never get the chance to practice it quietly enough," Ellie replied. "Everyone here trains their body. Almost nobody trains their mind with the same patience." The conversation stayed with Marsh long after she left his office, and in the weeks that followed, he found himself adjusting small elements of his training approach, introducing brief breathing exercises before difficult stations, encouraging cadets to treat obstacles as problems to be understood, rather than simply forces to be overpowered. It was a small shift, barely noticeable to most, but it marked the beginning of a change that would eventually reshape how the academy approached the impossible altogether. Colonel Harris called Ellie into his office a week later, the formal summons carrying a weight that made even the most composed cadets nervous. When she arrived, she found him standing near the window overlooking the training grounds, the obstacle course visible in the distance, quiet and empty in the afternoon light. "I built the impossible to reveal weakness," he said without turning around, "to show cadets exactly where their limits were, so they would never make the mistake of overestimating themselves in the field." He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "I never designed it to be beaten the way you beat it," he continued. "I'm not certain anyone else can replicate what you did." Ellie considered his words carefully before responding. "Maybe that's the wrong way to think about it," she said. "Maybe the trial was never really about beating an impossible standard. Maybe it was about discovering how much further any of us are capable of going than we believe." Harris was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an expression that suggested he was reconsidering something he had believed for years without ever questioning it. "You may be right," he said finally. News of the conversation spread quickly through the academy, though the exact details remained private between Ellie and the colonel. What mattered to most cadets was the visible shift that followed in the weeks after, small changes to training schedules, new emphasis on mental preparation alongside physical conditioning, adjustments that many instructors credited, quietly, to the quiet cadet, who had proven the impossible standard could be met. Ryan Coleman approached Ellie nearly 2 weeks after the final trial, finding her alone near the edge of the training grounds during a rare free afternoon. His usual confidence was tempered by something closer to genuine humility, an expression Ellie had never seen from him before. "I owe you an apology," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "I spent weeks assuming you didn't belong here, assuming the first trial was some kind of fluke." Ellie studied him for a moment, before responding, choosing not to dwell on the weeks of dismissive glances and quiet mockery that had followed her since her very first day. "You're not the only one who thought that," she said simply. "It doesn't matter anymore." "It matters to me," Ryan said. Watching you in that chamber during the final trial changed something. I've never seen anyone stay that calm under that kind of pressure. I don't think I could have done what you did." Ellie considered his words carefully, recognizing the difficulty it must have taken for someone as proud as Ryan to admit something so openly. "Everyone has a different version of that composure inside them," she said. "Yours might look different from mine. That doesn't mean it doesn't exist." Ryan nodded slowly, something in his posture relaxing for the first time in weeks. "Maybe I'll ask you to help me find it sometime," he said, a faint smile crossing his face for the first time since the trial had ended. Ellie returned the smile, small but genuine. "Anytime." Grace found her later that evening, sitting once again near the edge of the courtyard, watching the sun set slowly over the training grounds that had defined nearly every waking moment of her life for the past several months. The obstacle course stood quiet in the distance, no longer the fearsome, unbeatable structure it had once represented, but something else entirely now, a monument to what quiet, patient effort could accomplish, when given enough time and enough belief. "You know they're already talking about changing the name," Grace said, sitting down beside her. Ellie glanced over, curious. "Changing it to what?" Grace smiled. "Some of the instructors have started calling it something else already. Not the impossible anymore, just the standard. Your standard, specifically." Ellie was quiet for a long moment, considering the weight of those words, the strange, unexpected shape her journey at the academy had taken since that first freezing morning, when nobody had believed she belonged. "I never wanted to be a standard," she said finally. "I just wanted to understand what I was capable of." "Maybe that's exactly what makes you one," Grace replied. The two sat together in comfortable silence, as the sun disappeared below the horizon, the training grounds settling into darkness, quiet and still, waiting for the next class of cadets who would arrive in the coming months, unaware of the story that now lived within every corner of the academy's history. Ellie would go on to help redesign small elements of the training program in the months that followed, working quietly alongside Sergeant Marsh to introduce mental preparation techniques that would eventually become a permanent part of every cadet's early training. She never sought recognition for the changes, preferring instead to let the results speak for themselves, the same quiet philosophy that had carried her through every trial she had ever faced. Years later, new cadets would still hear whispered stories about the quiet recruit who had silenced an entire academy without ever raising her voice, without ever breaking beneath pressure that had broken countless cadets before her. Some versions of the story grew exaggerated with each retelling, but the core of it always remained the same, a reminder that strength was never only about physical power, and that the quietest people in any room were sometimes carrying the deepest kind of resolve, patiently waiting for the moment the world finally noticed. And somewhere on the training grounds, long after the final trial had ended and the crowds had gone home, the obstacle course stood in silence, no longer a symbol of what could not be done, but proof of exactly how far quiet determination could carry a person who refused to let doubt define them.